Sustainability is the big word in the global automotive industry right now, which is strategizing its future plans to achieve carbon neutrality in the best and fastest possible manner. Many automakers have already outlined their plans to only sell zero-emission vehicles by as early as 2030. To know more about what's transpiring in this space, we have with us Tom from S&P Global Mobility, and he's the Senior Director for Transport and Mobility Practice. Tom, welcome to the show, and thank you for taking out the time for this conversation.
Well, thank you for inviting me. So I look forward to our discussion.
So, Tom, I want to understand from you, how is the global automotive industry moving towards offering sustainable mobility solutions to customers?
Okay, it's a very big question, but let me try to break it down in a few different elements. So I think we could sort of roughly describe it as a twofold strategy. One being that some of the stakeholders in the industry are starting to explore what I would call mobility services, or let's call it mobility as a service, MaaS, as quite as often is referred to. While the other approach could be and particularly if you're a vehicle manufacturer, to start reviewing your product portfolios and really see what vehicles might make more sense from a sustainability perspective. So that's really at a higher level perspective. Now, if I look specifically about these mobility services, we have seen that a lot of the stakeholders are investing very heavily in technology and in software capabilities. And I think this is one of the reasons why there is sort of being dominated this sector by the technology companies, by Silicon Valley. The capital is there, they have the capabilities. And particularly if we look at the vehicle manufacturers today, many of them are struggling with the software capabilities. They're busy recruiting the right experts, all the other parts that we have. And all of this will help them to experiment with MaaS services like car sharing, ride-hailing services like Ola or Uber, and many other mobility solutions. I mean, we could be talking about micro-mobility or even looking to three-wheeled vehicles, very popular in India. But also mini cars, sort of like cars that aren't really regarded as homologated as a passenger car, but a little bit smaller. And I'm thinking here things like the new Citroën Ami, the Renault Twizy, which are starting to gain in importance. And I see more activity with vehicle manufacturers planning on a similar type of solution. So that is really all about improving the vehicle efficiency. And what do I mean with vehicle efficiency? It's all really about the energy usage in that vehicle. We have to more optimize it. Today, everything is about energy security. So it's vehicle efficiency and also scaling back the footprint of the vehicle. So that could either be a smaller vehicle, or we might have a vehicle that dimension-wise is a bit smaller, but because it's an EV, we have a lot more freedom with the interior. We have less intrusion from, transmission lines, all the other part. So the interior space could still be the same amount of space as people had before. So one other way of improving vehicle efficiency, particularly if you have a mobility service, is that we improve the occupancy rate. So more passengers in the vehicle, which makes it more energy efficient per passenger, and to improve the overall efficiency and ultimately the sustainability of this vehicle. Now, that's from the mobility service perspective. If I look at, reviewing product portfolios, there is really some similar degree of efficiency benefits that are being pursued, and we have to, but it's much harder because the industry, has really sort of been teaching our consumers each time we launch a new vehicle model, it's bigger, it's better. Right, and consumers have come to accept that now. And so if we now suddenly tell them, well, here's our latest model, and it's smaller, but it's better, it's more efficient, it's more sustainable, consumers might go like, well, I might still prefer that other vehicle because I have more space in there. It's the way that we think about it. And I think that's something that's a challenge. If you are the first vehicle manufacturer to set that step and have a slightly smaller vehicle, it's a very brave move, because it might be that consumer might say, well, thank you, but I'm going to shop at the other manufacturer. So you could potentially lose some sales. And of course, we also shouldn't forget that the whole world is buying SUVs or crossover vehicles today. So it's very challenging with them too, because they are typically much more heavier compared to a passenger car. So these are things that need to be looked at. And I would say that there is a huge opportunity here for car makers to look at their designers to kind of help them to come up with very clever designs, but also trying to turn that tide in terms of what I call excess vehicles. We don't need to have all these big, heavy, long, huge vehicles, and maybe head back to what I would refer to as a right-sized vehicle. So that would go a long way in terms of sustainability. But as we can imagine, I think it's psychologically a very big step to take for consumers. And I think we will have to take it step by step. So it's going to be a journey.
Right. Tom, you mentioned about SUVs. And related to SUVs comes the propulsion technology, which is diesel. So diesel is the dirty fuel, it's been in the limelight for all the wrong reasons. So if you could just, touch upon what future is left for diesels, globally, for diesel engines, especially in the passenger vehicle segment.
Okay, well, it's yeah, it's a big debate right now. Absolutely. I mean, vehicle manufacturers have always been very, very clever. I mean, we have very good engineering capabilities. And I think so far, if we look in the last 100 years of the automotive industry, we've managed to engineer solutions for any kind of step that the regulators have thrown at us. So, it is possible. Of course, the big question is at what cost? And I think that's really sort of where diesel might start to, see at least sort of at the horizon, the end of the of potentially of the usage from it. I don't think it's going to be as quickly maybe as some people might say. Again, it will depend region by region around the world. It's everybody has slightly different rules and regulations. But I do think that yes, it's inevitable that it will start to decline, but there are still opportunities, I think, depending in some markets around the world, to have a hybrid diesel vehicle so we can expand that lifespan of the vehicle. So there are, I wouldn't say we're ready to give up on it yet, particularly, say, if you look at a very heavy SUV or a heavy premium luxury car. They are heavy. They are very challenging to electrify, because of range issues, other parts. So there are still opportunities to do a little bit more. And in that segment of the market, costs are more accepted by some of the consumer base from that, because they just want a particular vehicle, and that might be one of the vehicles that could potentially be candidates beyond that for, say, hydrogen, like fuel cell vehicles or other parts.
Right. And coming to that regulation, Tom, so, at the COP26 in Glasgow last year, so, there was a sort of countries had signed a declaration, where many of them have pledged to completely stop the sales of internal combustion engines by like 2035, like you mentioned. I'm talking about a country like India, which I represent. So, we are still a very emerging market, we're a developing country, and the car penetration is not that huge right now. It's only 32 people to 1,000 of the population. So how do we ensure sustainability, when we still haven't mobilized a chunk of our population?
It's a really great question. I think the whole COP26, last year about this time almost. Well, it was the
Right.
end of October, in Glasgow. It's how to start on this. I think first of all, you mentioned the 2035 date, which wanted many of the countries, the nations, and companies there to sign up to, and it was a bit of a struggle to get everybody to sign up to it. It was almost sort of like, I wouldn't call it a failure, but it was definitely a very muted sort of overall outcome from it. And I think part of it was to do with the fact that the transport declaration, which was separately from the final end document, which was discussed on Transport Day, which I think was on the Wednesday. And so we had many vehicle manufacturers present there, and also some government representatives from leading nations. And it wasn't easy, because probably about half of them didn't want to sign it because of the language of the document. And one of the real reasons was that the language of that document was really such that it only supported zero emission vehicles. So anything that still has you're not allowed to have any emissions, so no exhaust, which has an impact. You can't have a combustion engine, all the other parts. And that was, for many vehicle manufacturers, undesirable, because we're closing the door on potentially other solutions that could be viable, depending where we are in the world. And they could potentially be, at least, if not, no emissions, but they could be net zero. So in the interest of, technology solutions, all the other part, they said, we refuse to sign this. And that's really been sort of the core of this part, really. And I think, we really have to kind of see that, there are other, potential solutions. I think we're looking in Europe. Europe voted, in the European Parliament at the Commission level to effectively start banning internal combustion engine sales by 2035. But it was a huge, long debate going on. And again, we haven't really seen the end of it yet, because they managed to lobby in another clause there that new research on e-fuels will need to be done, and potentially to be recognized that, okay, that would be allowed. So that means that actually not all vehicles would be zero emissions if we want to do it literally by the letter. And I think there are even several other vehicle manufacturers who are still researching and testing today with a vehicle with an internal combustion engine, which they will run with directly injecting hydrogen in there. So it is an internal combustion engine that will run on hydrogen. It's modified, and that could, again, I mean, the emissions from that vehicle will be clean. So there are many other solutions out there, and I think, if the industry can make it work, the attraction is there, because it is obviously much more cheaper than going full electric on there, and we have an installed legacy infrastructure at manufacturers to continue manufacturing internal combustion engines, the componentry that goes in there, all the other parts. So that would, to some degree, also benefit a country like India, where there is an established automotive industry, very well-established industry, and the switch over to electric could cause, not just in India, even in Germany, in the US, a significant unemployment level. So this is, at a kind of sort of geopolitical level, a significant topic. So I think that we have to expect that there will be more pushback for this, and particularly in the aftermath of what we're seeing now with Russia, Ukraine, how unstable the global situation is. We can see that governments are quickly approving new coal exploration. We're talking about new oil exploration. That was unthinkable, when we were a year ago in Glasgow at the COP26. People would say, no, we won't do this anymore. So, situations change. So we have to look at it like that. But I think clearly the future, we have to be realistic, holds many opportunities for ZEF vehicles, particularly sort of what we would call BEV, so a battery electric vehicle, or a fuel cell electric vehicle in particular. But it might be too early, I think, to write off the ICE engine yet. Now, it might not be an ICE engine as we know it today, or at least, the fuels that we use it. But I think that there is definitely, you look at India, as you mentioned, but I think South America, Southeast Asia, maybe Africa or other parts, there are a lot of markets out there still where there is a huge desire and hunger for people to own a car, and EVs effectively still are unaffordable for most of those consumers. So it's like, as you mentioned, the motorization rate, the number of vehicles per 1,000 population is still very low in India and in all these other markets. So there is huge potential, particularly in India, and I think that is one of the reasons why manufacturers want to keep all their options open, at least, looking forward into the future. So, but just a bit more, few words on India, really, because I know we have our Indian audience here. It's a very interesting example. So most people in India today are unable to afford to buy their own car, but what they can afford is to buy miles or kilometers every week. So, and this sort of brings us back to mobility services, and Ola, obviously, among the very famous one and successful one, as well as Uber. So we have many of these families who can afford to buy weekly journeys or miles or kilometers. And the only problem that we saw in India over the last few years has been that, people who want to drive on those platforms, they can't afford to have a car. So what these platforms did, they were effectively offering subsidized loans, leases. So people could buy a car through the platform and then start providing these mobility services. And in fact, we over the last 3 years or 4 years actually had to increase our new sales expectations for India on an annual basis because there were so many sales happening to those platforms to provide those journeys. So there is also an impact from there. So we shouldn't forget to just look at personal vehicle ownership. It's also about mobility services as well. And I think India is clearly leading the world in terms of MaaS potential. You have a huge population still growing. The population, if we look between now and say 2050 and outlook, we expect that there's a huge increase in people who are able to afford to buy their own car, but also MaaS services. So from a sustainability perspective, I think it's these vehicles that are really, they are being driven the most, with a higher vehicle occupancy rate in there, more people in there. So in a way, they are by default more efficient than that same vehicle that would be used by somebody who owns that car in Paris, in London, in Germany, or in the US.
Right. On that optimistic note, I think, Tom, it's time to close this conversation. It was a lovely conversation talking to you, and getting all the insights about sustainability. Like you rightly mentioned, it's finally the time for people to understand that having the right size vehicle for transportation and adopting maybe multimodal transportation, possibly that's the answer to a sustainable future for better skies for our children, like a company says in its tagline. So thank you so much for that, and really, really lovely talking to you, and wish you all the best in your future researches as well. Thank you so much for the time.
Right. Well, thank you.